For people in Boston with long memories, an elected school committee evokes the infamy of hardline segregation and a lack of spending power for mayors. But more recently, there has also been plenty of frustration with the appointed committee, culminating last fall with the resignation of the committee's previous chair. That set the stage for a public opinion survey by Poll Progressive, in which Boston voters were asked to choose between appointed and elected. To tell us about the results is the co-founder and communication strategist with Poll Progressive, David Fadul. Thank you very much for being with us, David.
Thank you so much for having me.
David, you heard my summary of the events here in Boston, the infamous hot mic comment by the chair of the school committee that led to his prompt resignation. But other than that, what set the stage for this?
So this survey was created basically out of academic interest. We self-funded this poll because we wanted to know how attitudes about this topic had shifted. There hasn't been a question about this in many, many years, likely since the 1996 referendum. And there had been a steady buildup of news, unfortunately bad headlines about the committee. Lecanto was kind of the capstone to all that, but there
He was
had
the
been
chair that I referred to, right?
yes,
Michael.
exactly. But there was also the Boston Foundation report that came out that showed that there was a de facto resegregation of a lot of schools, and I feel like that culmination of headlines coupled with our interest in the topic is what led to this poll.
Yeah. What about the people that you talked to in this poll? Anything you can tell about the cross section in terms of age, for example?
Sure. So we texted a random number of 15,000 cell phones. We got a sample of 480 respondents, which was a 4.4% margin of error. And we weighted by gender, age, and ethnicity to get a representative sample. But we also only included people who knew of Mayor Walsh and who said they were somewhat or likely voters. And we did this because we felt that was a fair gauge of who is connected and interested in city politics and who would turn out in an off-year election. We polled this, in December, and this is an off-year election. So if this was going to come up, that would be the likely electorate that would be talking about this.
And of course, they are pretty close to the racial composition of the city too.
Yes, we wanted to make sure that this sample was representative of the city, for sure.
So what was the result as far as appointed versus elected?
Sure. So we asked if people would support a change to an elected committee, and we found that 60% of respondents supported that change. Only 14% opposed, and about 27% had no opinion. So what that told us was a couple things. Number one, 60% is a pretty strong majority in favor of a change. That's likely due to the buildup of the negative press, just dissatisfaction with the status quo. There's also that low number of people who had no opinion indicates that this is a topic, as you said, that a lot of people have an interest in talking about. People have opinions, whether it's in support or oppose. An overwhelming majority wanted to say something about this, right? So that's something interesting. And finally, the cross-section of, when we looked at the analysis, people of color, specifically Black and Hispanic respondents, had the highest percentage of support for change, which was a really interesting result.
I'm also interested in the way you asked about the either or question here, because it brought up something that I didn't think about very much, and that is that Boston is an outlier in having an appointed committee.
Yes, so that portion of the question where we put it in the context, it really speaks to how we formulated the question, which was to provide as much context with as few words as possible. We want people to answer this question without flooding them with a deluge of exposition about the history of it. But by putting it in the context of the rest of the state, we really grounded the question in reality. People understood that this question was a legitimate thing to ask. Other cities have it, Boston doesn't. We didn't say whether that's a good or a bad thing, just that it is something, just to give them an idea that this is a legitimate question.
Well, one thing that way of couching it certainly reminded me, as someone who's a longtime Bostonian, is that this city does have a long history of its home rule being curbed. I mean, I get emotional about that. I mean,
Mhm,
does
mhm.
does this question do that really?
Well, we didn't ask about the home rule issue. I know that there has been a ton of discussion about it, and in the early fights in the '90s about changing it, the fights happened both at the city level and with representatives in the legislature. It actually reminds me a little bit of, I'm from DC. We have a lot of home rule issues like this, so that really resonated with me. So when I was researching this issue, that totally struck home with me.
I'm also curious about the other issues that people are concerned about, because you asked a question about that. They are very concerned about the schools, it would seem, but that wasn't exactly the number one issue. What were the issues that were higher than education?
Yeah, so we found that obviously COVID-19 was one of the most important issues for people. We also found housing to be a really important issue. Those two really topped the list. We've seen housing be talked about. If you look at city council races, I know you did a lot of work interviewing almost every city council candidate, and I think almost all of them talked about housing in some way. This is an issue that really affects Boston and is changing. And then, of course, COVID-19 affects everything. So those were the top issues we found. Education isn't the most motivating factor, but it is something that a lot of people pay attention to, and a lot of people have a personal stake in through their children.
Well, your survey results are now out there in public, and you have your ideas about how you might want to use them going forward. But because they're public, other people can do that as well. What do you imagine that could mean?
In terms of how this might be replicated.
Well, not so much even replicated. We're coming into a city election year right now. People are going to be running for office. They're going to look at these results. So, what do you see as a ripple effect?
Well, my hope is that people pay attention to the results and understand that this is a topic that people want to talk about. They shouldn't shy away from discussing this. And I think that they should understand that there's a demand for change out there. People are, from what our results show, people are demanding a change. We specifically included the word change in our question, and people responded to that. They supported it. So when people are campaigning, there is no incumbent anymore to defend the current appointed board. So there's probably going to be a lot of candidates. It's likely they'll be discussing it. There'll be conversations about it. And ultimately, I feel that a conversation about this is long needed, and that's reflected in the results.
Tell me a little bit about Washington, at least what you see there with the elected school committee, because I imagine, an elected board means maybe more transparency, more back and forth about, even divisive issues. But on the other hand, get a lot of special interests who are going to be chipping in, backing candidates who will do their bidding. So how does that work out?
Yeah, so in DC, of course, there's plenty of benefits and flaws. Our school committee, interestingly, we have had a long struggle with getting self-determination in DC. But interestingly, the school committee has been the thing. We got access to the school committee first of anything, any elected board that we had. We got school committee before we even got an elected mayor or city council. And I think it's because people view education as such an important foundational issue. Uh, Now, when it comes to special interest money, I think it's a little unfair to blame the school committee for a systemic problem. Dark money does come into state house races, the mayoral race, city council races even, but no one's advocating for the abolition of our electoral system. I think instead we should just have campaign finance reform that cuts into that. So I think, of course, there are flaws with it, but one other thing I'll add is it leads to a lot of discussion and debate, as opposed to the current committee, which, as the Boston Herald found, almost always votes in unison, and there's almost never dissent.
We should mention that if people want to see your survey in more detail, is there a place where they can check that out online, perhaps?
Yes, they can go to pollprogressive.com, and we have these results there, as well as information about us.
Great. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to join us.
Absolutely, it's been my pleasure.
David Fadul from Poll Progressive.